In the spring of 1923, a wealthy English aristocrat scratched a mosquito bite on his cheek while shaving, and within weeks, he was dead. He was one of the first men to walk into the sealed tomb of a boy king who had been sealed underground for 3,000 years. And he would not be the last to die. Over the next decade, one by one, the people who entered that tomb began to fall. A fever nobody could explain. A death by violence. A man who wrote a final message in his own blood before he hanged himself. The newspapers called it the curse of the pharaoh. And for almost 100 years, that word, curse, was where the story stopped. But the curse was never the real mystery. The real mystery is that the deaths were real. People genuinely died. And in 2024 and 2025, scientists finally identified what was actually waiting inside that tomb, sealed in the dark for 3,000 years, silent and patient and very much alive. It was not a spell. It was not the ghost of a king. It was something biological, something that can lie dormant for millennia and then wake up the moment fresh air and human lungs arrive. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The exact same thing was found in a second sealed royal tomb, half a world away, 50 years later, and it killed 10 people in a matter of weeks. So this is not a video about a superstition. This is a video about what was really hidden inside King Tut's tomb, what it did to the men who opened it, and why the answer took a century to uncover. Because the boy king's tomb was hiding 3 separate secrets. The deaths were only the first. There was something strange about the tomb itself, something that made it different from every other pharaoh's grave in the valley. And there was a final discovery, made only recently, that turned the whole legend inside out. By the end, you will understand why the curse was fake, why the danger was real, and why that danger is now sitting inside a laboratory being tested as a cure for cancer. Let's start with the man who died first. His name was George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, and he was not a scientist. He was a rich English lord who loved fast cars and Egyptian treasures, and he had been pouring his fortune into a hole in the ground for years. The man doing the actual digging was an archaeologist named Howard Carter, and for 15 years, Carter had found almost nothing worth the headlines. By 1922, Carnarvon was ready to quit. He told Carter he would fund one final season, and if it turned up empty, that was the end. That final season is the only reason we know the name Tutankhamun at all. On the 4th of November, 1922, a boy carrying water is said to have stumbled over a stone in the sand. It was not a stone, it was the top of a buried staircase. Carter cleared the steps and found a sealed doorway. He filled the whole thing back in, sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England, and waited 2 weeks for the Lord to sail to Egypt before he would open it. That patience tells you something. Carter knew what he might be standing on top of. On the 26th of November, Carter made a small hole in the corner of a second sealed door and pushed a candle through. The flame flickered because hot air was escaping from inside, air that had been trapped in that chamber for over 3,000 years. Carnarvon, standing behind him, asked if he could see anything, and Carter said the only thing anyone remembers from this entire story. He said, yes, wonderful things, gold, statues, chariots, a wall of treasure glittering in the candlelight. It was the most intact royal tomb ever found in Egypt, the only one that grave robbers had never fully emptied, because debris had buried the entrance and hidden it for millennia. 5 months later, Carnarvon was dead. Here is where the mainstream story and the mystery split apart. The official cause of death was blood poisoning. Carnarvon had nicked an infected mosquito bite while shaving. The wound turned septic, and that infection led to pneumonia and organ failure. He died in a Cairo hotel on the 5th of April, 1923. Simple, medical, boring. Except it wasn't boring at all because of what happened around it. His son later claimed that at the exact moment his father died, every light in Cairo went out. A citywide blackout with no explanation the power company could give. And back in England, on that same night, Carnarvon's dog is said to have let out a single howl and dropped dead. Now, you can call that coincidence. Plenty of people do, but something else was happening in the background. Something that turned one rich man's death into a global panic. 2 weeks before Carnarvon died, a best-selling novelist named Marie Corelli published a warning in the press. She wrote that terrible punishment would come to anyone who forced their way into a sealed Egyptian tomb. When Carnarvon died right on schedule, she looked like a prophet. And then, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who created Sherlock Holmes, told American reporters that an evil spirit conjured by the tomb's ancient priests could have struck Carnarvon down. The creator of the world's most logical detective had just endorsed a magic curse. The story went around the planet, and then the story started killing people on its own. That's the second clue, and it's the one that kept the legend alive for a century. Because if it had only been Carnarvon, the world would have forgotten by summer. It didn't stop at Carnarvon. A month after the Earl died, an American railroad millionaire named George J. Gould visited the tomb. He was healthy when he arrived in Egypt. He caught a fever almost immediately after seeing the burial site, and he was dead within days. Then came Aubrey Herbert, Carnarvon's own half-brother, dead by September of that same year. Then, a radiologist named Sir Archibald Douglas Ryde, the man who had x-rayed the mummy itself, dead in 1924. Then Carnarvon's secretary, a man named Richard Bethel, who was one of the first people to step into the tomb behind Carter. In 1929, he was found smothered to death in his bed at an exclusive London gentleman's club. No clear cause, just dead in the night. And after Bethel died, his own father, racked by grief and rumors of the curse, took his own life. The list kept growing, and each new name made the legend heavier. There was Arthur Mace, one of the senior members of Carter's own excavation team, a man who had physically helped break through the sealed wall into the burial chamber. Mace fell ill during the work, grew weaker over the following years, and died in 1928. Some accounts claimed arsenic poisoning. Others said pneumonia. Either way, another man who had stood in that chamber was in the ground. There was Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, an Egyptian who had visited the tomb, shot dead by his own wife in a London hotel in 1923. There was Sir Lee Stack, the Governor General of Sudan, assassinated in the streets of Cairo in 1924. None of these deaths had anything to do with a fungus or a pharaoh, but it didn't matter. By then, the curse had become a lens. Any death that touched anyone who had been anywhere near that tomb was pulled into the story and counted as another victim. The legend was feeding on itself. Even the small, strange details got swept in. Howard Carter had given a friend a paperweight as a gift, made from a mummified human hand, its wrist wrapped in a bracelet, supposedly inscribed with the warning, "Cursed be he who moves my body." Not long after receiving it, the friend's house burned to the ground. When he tried to rebuild it, the new house was hit by a flood. An American Egyptologist named Aaron Ember, who was close friends with several people present at the tomb's opening, died in 1926 when his own house in Baltimore burned down less than an hour after he had hosted a dinner party. He could have escaped, but he went back for a manuscript he was writing and never came out. Every one of these stories, on its own, is ordinary tragedy. Stacked together and printed under the word curse, they became something that felt like a pattern closing in. But the death that terrified people the most belonged to a man named Hugh Evelyn White. He was a British Egyptologist, one of the first to enter the tomb alongside Carter. He watched death sweep through the people around him, one after another, for 2 years, and then, by his own hand, he ended his life. But before he did, he left a message. He wrote it, according to the reports, in his own blood. The words were, "I have succumbed to a curse which forces me to disappear." Think about that. This was not a superstitious villager. This was a trained scholar, a man of science, and he became so convinced that something was hunting the people who had entered that tomb that he wrote a farewell in blood and took his own life. Whatever was happening, it was real enough to a lot of intelligent people that it drove at least one of them to the edge. And that is the question that sat unanswered for 100 years. Not, is there a magic curse? Because there obviously isn't. The real question is darker and more specific. Why did healthy people who entered a specific sealed chamber keep dying, while the man who ran the whole excavation walked away untouched? Because that is the strangest part of all. Howard Carter, the person most responsible for violating the tomb, the first human being to break the seal, the man who spent 10 years inside it cataloging every object by hand, was never harmed by any curse. He lived until 1939 and died of cancer at 64, 17 years after he opened the tomb. If a pharaoh wanted revenge, Carter should have been victim number one. He wasn't. And that single fact is the thread that eventually unravels the entire mystery. Hold on to it, because it becomes the key to everything. If you're the kind of person who wants the real answer behind the legend and not just the ghost story, subscribe, because this channel investigates the science hidden inside ancient mysteries every single week. Now, before we get to what was actually inside that tomb, we need to deal with the phrase that started it all. Because there is a piece of this legend that almost everyone believes, and it turns out to be completely false. And once you understand why it's false, the truth becomes much scarier. The story goes that Howard Carter found a written curse carved above the doorway of the tomb. A warning inscribed in hieroglyphs that said something like, "Death shall come on swift wings to whoever disturbs the peace of the king." That inscription is quoted in books, in films, in documentaries. It is the smoking gun of the entire curse legend. And it does not exist. Carter never recorded any such curse in his diaries. No such inscription has ever been documented anywhere in Tutankhamun's tomb. The line was invented later, layered onto the story by writers who needed the legend to have a source. For decades, scholars pointed at this and said, "See, the whole thing is a fantasy. No curse was written, therefore there was no danger. Case closed." But that explanation has a problem. Because while the written curse was fake, ancient Egyptians absolutely did put real curses on some tombs. They just weren't royal tombs, and they weren't from Tutankhamun's era. They come from private tombs over 1,000 years older, from the Old Kingdom. And here is the crucial part. When you actually read what those ancient curses threaten, they don't read like magic spells. They read like warnings. One real inscription from the tomb of a man named Kentika Ikeki promises that anyone who enters the tomb in an unclean state will be seized and punished. Unclean, contaminated, that is not the language of the supernatural. That is the language of a people who had noticed, across thousands of years of digging into sealed chambers, that something inside those chambers made people sick. They couldn't see it. They had no microscopes, no idea what a spore was. So they described the danger the only way they could. They called it a curse. They called the contamination unclean. They weren't recording a superstition. They were recording an observation. Something inside sealed tombs could hurt you, and they were trying to warn you. They weren't guessing, they were recording. And it would take modern science 3,000 years to catch up to what those ancient Egyptians had already figured out. Which brings us to the third clue, and the one nobody could test until very recently. If the danger inside these tombs was real and physical, then it should leave physical evidence. It should be findable. And to find it, scientists needed a second tomb, a control case. They needed the exact same thing to happen again, somewhere else, so they could pull the bodies apart and study what actually killed people. And there was a reason Tutankhamun's tomb, of all the tombs in that valley, was the perfect trap. Nearly every other royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings had been broken into by grave robbers in ancient times. opened and emptied and left exposed to the air over the centuries. Tutankhamun's was different. It had been almost perfectly sealed. Debris from later construction had buried the entrance and hidden it for over 3,000 years, which is exactly why its treasures survived. But that same perfect seal did something else. It created a closed environment, cut off from light and airflow, packed with organic material. The tomb had been stocked with food, with flowers, with linen, everything a king would need in the afterlife. To a fungus, that is not a burial chamber. That is a sealed larder, a perfect, undisturbed place to grow slowly in the dark and wait. The very thing that made the tomb a miracle of preservation may also be what made it dangerous. To confirm that, though, scientists needed a second case, a control. They needed the same disaster to strike again somewhere they could actually study it. They got it in Poland 50 years later. In the early 1970s, a team of researchers opened the tomb of a Polish king named Casimir IV, who had been sealed in his crypt in Krakow since the 15th century. 12 people entered that tomb. Within weeks, 10 of them were dead. Not over a decade, the way the Tutankhamun deaths played out. Within weeks, it was the mummy's curse all over again. Except this time, it happened in the modern age, in a country with hospitals and pathologists, and the ability to run tests. And this time, somebody found the answer. And this is where it becomes almost impossible to write off as coincidence, because the parallels between the two tombs are exact. Both were sealed royal burials. Both had been closed for centuries, one for 500 years, one for over 3,000. Both were opened by a small team of educated professionals. And in both cases, the people who died did not die instantly from some obvious injury. They sickened and faded, their lungs failing, over days and weeks and months. 2 kings, 2 sealed crypts, 2 clusters of dead men. The only difference was that by the 1970s, science finally had the tools to do what nobody could do in 1923. Cut the mystery open and look at what was actually inside. A Polish microbiologist named Bolesław Smyk took samples from inside the tomb. And in those samples, throughout the sealed chamber, he found a specific organism, a mold. Its name is Aspergillus flavus, named for its yellow spores. And this is the thing that had been hiding in the dark all along. The reports that came out of Poland were stark. Of the 12 who entered, 10 were dead within a short window, and later analysis tied more than a dozen deaths connected to the research back to the same source. The fungus, investigators concluded, had almost certainly grown inside the tomb during the medieval period, feeding on organic material sealed in with the king. When the crypt was opened, it did exactly what such an organism does. It bloomed into the disturbed air and into the lungs of everyone present. In a socialist Poland, where advanced microbiology and archaeology was rare, it took time and effort to reach that conclusion. But once they did, the same explanation snapped backward across 50 years and locked onto the deaths in Egypt like a key sliding into a lock. Here is why it fits so perfectly. Aspergillus flavus can survive for centuries, even thousands of years, sealed inside a tomb with no light and no fresh air. It goes dormant. It waits. And the moment a chamber is opened, the moment fresh air rushes in, and human beings start breathing that air, the spores are released. In most healthy people, breathing them in causes nothing worse than an allergy. But in a person with a weakened immune system, those spores can take root in the lungs and cause a severe, sometimes fatal, respiratory infection. The toxins the fungus produces can lead directly to the kind of pneumonia and organ failure that killed people. Now go back to Lord Carnarvon. Carnarvon was not a healthy man. He had been in a devastating car accident years earlier that left him physically fragile, and he suffered from chronic lung infections for the rest of his life. His immune system was already compromised. He was, medically speaking, exactly the kind of person a lungful of ancient fungal spores would kill. And in 2003, Researchers writing to the medical journal The Lancet made this argument directly. The pattern of Carnarvon's death, pneumonia following a respiratory collapse, fit an Aspergillus infection. Studies of other mummies have found not one, but two dangerous species of this mold, Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus niger, living on the ancient bandages. A French researcher studying these spores put it plainly: the death of Lord Carnarvon could be explained by infection with a highly virulent, extremely long-lived pathogen. Not a curse, a fungus. The same fungus, in two sealed royal tombs, on two continents, 50 years apart, killing the same kind of victims the same way. And now, finally, look back at Howard Carter. Remember the thread. Carter opened the tomb, spent 10 years inside it, and was never harmed. Why? Because Carter was a healthy man with a functioning immune system. The same spores that killed the frail, sick Carnarvon did nothing to the robust Carter. The curse didn't spare Carter because it liked him. Biology spared him because his body could fight off what Carnarvon's body could not. The one fact that made no sense under the curse theory makes perfect sense the moment you understand what was really inside that chamber. That is how you know the fungus explanation is real. It doesn't just explain who died. It explains who survived. Now, does this prove every single curse death was caused by mold? No. And this is where we have to be honest, because the grounded truth is more interesting than the fantasy. Most of the people who supposedly died from the curse did not die of anything mysterious at all. When you actually count the numbers, the legend falls apart. Of the 58 people present when the tomb and the sarcophagus were opened, only 8 died within the following 12 years. The rest lived on, many of them for decades. In 2002, the British Medical Journal ran a proper statistical study on 44 Westerners that Carter identified as being in Egypt at the time, and it found no significant difference in how long they lived compared to anyone else. Statistically, being at the opening of King Tut's tomb did not shorten your life. And the individual deaths, when you look closely, mostly explain themselves. The radiologist who x-rayed the mummy developed cancer, which is a known risk of years of radiation exposure in that era, not a pharaoh's revenge. Carter's secretary, who was found smothered, may well have been murdered by ordinary human hands. Evelyn White, the man who wrote in his own blood, was almost certainly a fragile mind pushed over the edge by the very hysteria the newspapers had manufactured. The curse became a self-fulfilling machine. The more the press screamed about death, the more any death near the tomb got counted as proof. There was also a much less mystical reason the media went so wild. Carnarvon had sold the exclusive rights to the story to a single newspaper, the Times of London. Every other paper on Earth was locked out, standing in the desert with nothing to print. So they invented something to print. They printed the curse. The legend of the mummy's curse may have been born less from an ancient king and more from a swarm of angry journalists with no story and a deadline. So the grounded truth is this: there was no supernatural curse. Most of the deaths were coincidence, disease, and the ordinary bad luck of the era, amplified by a hungry press. But underneath all of that noise, a real danger was hiding. And it was real enough to kill at least a few of the most vulnerable people who breathed the tomb's ancient air. The ancient Egyptians sensed it. The word unclean, carved into a tomb 1,000 years before Tutankhamun was, in its own primitive way, a correct medical warning. And it took until 2024 and 2025 for science to fully confirm what they had been trying to tell us. Because here is the final turn, the one that makes this whole story worth telling. That same killer fungus, Aspergillus flavus, the pharaoh's curse itself, is now sitting in a laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania, and it may be about to save lives instead of taking them. In 2025, researchers announced they had extracted a rare new class of molecules from this exact fungus, compounds they named asparagomycins. These molecules belong to a rare and strange family of compounds, difficult to isolate and almost never seen coming out of a fungus, with intricate interlocking ring structures that let them interact with living cells in unusually powerful ways. The researchers bioengineered them for potency, and when they tested those compounds against human leukemia cells, the molecules attacked the cancer with startling precision, disrupting the ability of cancer cells to divide and doing it with a specificity that rivaled drugs already approved and in use. The study was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. The team that pulled this cure out of the curse was based at the University of Pennsylvania, the same institution whose scholars have spent generations decoding the ancient world. There is something almost poetic in that. The place that studies the pharaohs is now the place turning the pharaoh's curse into a treatment. The very organism that sealed itself inside a boy king's tomb and struck down the men who opened it is now being engineered into a weapon against one of the deadliest cancers we know. Think about what that means. For 3,000 years, this thing waited in the dark. It killed a lord. It terrified the world. It hid behind a legend so powerful that people wrote about it in their own blood. And when we finally dragged it into the light and looked at what it truly was, it turned out to be not a curse, but a cure that had been waiting for us to become smart enough to use it. The Egyptians called it unclean. We might end up calling it medicine. And if that's true, it means the ancient warnings carved into those tombs weren't superstition at all. They were the oldest recorded observation of a pathogen in human history. A chapter of medical science written in hieroglyphs that we ignored for 30 centuries because we were too busy being afraid of ghosts to notice the truth sitting right in front of us. But there is one question that still has no answer. If a single sealed chamber in the Valley of the Kings held something this dangerous and this valuable, hidden for 3,000 years until we happened to open it, then what is still waiting inside all the tombs we haven't opened yet? The Valley of the Kings is not empty. Ground-penetrating radar keeps finding voids behind walls, sealed spaces no living person has entered. Some of those chambers have been closed since before the fall of Rome, and whatever is dormant inside them, sleeping in the dark, does not know that 3,000 years have passed. It only knows how to wait. The tomb of Tutankhamun is quiet now, its treasures behind glass, its danger cataloged and named. But the valley around it is still full of sealed doors, still full of trapped air that no one has breathed, still waiting for the next candle to push through the next hole in the next wall and the next voice to say wonderful things. If mysteries like this one keep you up at night, the next investigation is already on screen. Watch it now.